That was a sort of magical time in my life doing that. I mean, it's like a dream when you're there. It's those incredible beaches, that incredible life.
Picture the pitch meeting. A British police officer dropped into a sun-soaked Caribbean island, forced to solve a murder every week while wearing a wool suit in 90-degree heat. It sounds like a sitcom premise, not the backbone of one of the longest-running crime dramas on British television. And yet, for well over a decade, that exact premise has kept audiences coming back, season after season, killing after killing, goodbye after goodbye. Because here's the strange part. The show is called Death in Paradise, but Paradise never keeps its detective. Every single lead investigator who has stepped off that plane onto the fictional island of St. Marie has eventually stepped right back off it, through death, heartbreak, exhaustion, or quiet personal growth. Richard Poole didn't get to leave gracefully. Humphrey Goodman left chasing love. Jack Mooney left chasing peace. Neville Parker left chasing courage. And now Mervyn Wilson is the one carrying the torch, walking the same beach his predecessors once found unbearable. Most shows would never survive this kind of turnover. Imagine if Columbo quietly became a different detective every few years, or if Sherlock Holmes wandered off partway through a season and was replaced by a stranger claiming the same flat on Baker Street. Audiences would revolt. But Death in Paradise didn't just survive replacing its lead actor 5 times. It somehow made the replacement itself part of the appeal. So the real question isn't just why do they leave? It's how does a show built entirely around one outsider's discomfort keep working when that outsider changes every few years? Most detective fiction protects its central figure like the crown jewels. The mystery changes weekly, but the mind solving it stays fixed. That's the entire appeal of a Poirot or a Vera, familiarity with a particular way of seeing the world. Death in Paradise flipped that logic on its head almost by accident, and then leaned into it once it realized what it had. Every detective who has served on St. Marie arrived carrying some kind of emotional baggage the island was uniquely equipped to unpack. Richard Poole was buttoned up to the point of parody, a man allergic to spontaneity, and it often seemed to joy itself. Humphrey Goodman arrived scattered and heartbroken, his personal life in pieces behind him. Jack Mooney showed up warm on the surface, but quietly grieving underneath. Neville Parker was a walking catalog of phobias, a man whose fears had shrunk his entire world down to something manageable and small. And Mervyn Wilson, the newest addition, arrived guarded and sharp-edged, clearly protecting something he isn't ready to name. The island doesn't just give these men crimes to solve. It gives them themselves to solve. St. Marie becomes a kind of unofficial therapist, forcing each detective into situations that expose exactly the thing he's spent years avoiding. And once that healing actually happens, once the discomfort that made the character funny or compelling starts to fade, the show faces an uncomfortable truth. A detective who is fully adapted to paradise no longer fits the premise of being a fish out of water. So he has to go. Not because the writers ran out of ideas, but because the format demands fresh friction, and comfort is the one thing this show can't use. Richard Poole, played by Ben Miller, was the detective the entire format was built around, and arguably the hardest character the show ever had to write, because he was designed to be almost unlikable on paper. He hated the heat. He hated the informality. He hated rum, beaches, and casual conversation. He wore a full suit on a tropical island as a kind of quiet protest against having to be there at all. It should have made him insufferable. Instead, it made him magnetic because underneath the rigidity was a man who had built his entire identity around control, and control was the one thing St. Marie refused to give him. Across 2 series, viewers watched something unexpected happen. Poole started, almost against his will, to loosen. He grew genuinely close to his team. He developed something resembling trust, something resembling warmth. It was subtle, the kind of change you only notice in hindsight, but it was there. And that created a real problem for the writers because Ben Miller had decided to leave the show, largely due to the demands of long stretches of filming abroad away from his family, a detail that says a lot about how different the show's reality is from its postcard image. The production couldn't just have Poole quietly transfer back to London. That would have felt like a betrayal of everything the character represented, a man too stubborn to ever fully surrender to change, suddenly deciding to walk away peacefully. So the show made the boldest possible choice. It killed him. In the opening minutes of Series 3, Richard Poole was murdered. The man who spent 2 years explaining exactly how everyone died became, without warning, the body on the floor. It was a shocking moment for what had always been a cozy, comforting show, but it did something crucial for the franchise's future. It proved that nobody on St. Marie was safe from consequence. not even the person the entire series had been built around. That single decision gave every future storyline permission to take real risks, because the show had already demonstrated it wasn't afraid to lose its most important character. Replacing a murdered fan-favorite lead is about as difficult an assignment as television offers, and that's exactly the position Chris Marshall was placed in as Humphrey Goodman. Where Poole was closed off and precise, Humphrey was an open book, clumsy, emotionally transparent, prone to apologizing to inanimate objects and occasionally to corpses. If the writers had made him too similar to Poole, he would have felt like a pale imitation. Instead, they billed him as Poole's near-total opposite, and it worked because Marshall brought a genuine, unguarded warmth to the role that made his chaos endearing rather than grating. Humphrey wasn't running from discomfort with the island the way Poole was. He was running from a broken engagement and a life that had quietly fallen apart back home. St. Marie gave him something Poole never really wanted, a chance to rebuild, slowly, through friendship and routine rather than dramatic breakthroughs. He came to genuinely love the island, the team, and the rhythm of life there, arguably more than any detective before or after him. But his departure revealed something important about the show's underlying philosophy. Not every ending needs to be tragic. Humphrey left St. Marie to pursue a relationship, choosing a different kind of future over the island that had rebuilt him. And years later, that decision paid off in an unexpected way when the character resurfaced in the spin-off Beyond Paradise, proving that a detective story didn't have to end when he left the Caribbean behind. It could simply continue somewhere else. Poole's ending was closure through finality. Humphrey's was closure through possibility. Together, they gave the franchise two completely different templates for how to say goodbye. Ardal O'Hanlon's Jack Mooney brought yet another emotional register to the role. Easy charm, quick humor, and a relaxed manner that made suspects underestimate him right up until he'd already worked out exactly what they'd done. Compared to Poole's rigidity and Humphrey's disorder, Jack felt settled, almost paternal. But that calm exterior sat on top of real loss. Jack was a widower, and his arrival on St. Marie wasn't about ambition or opportunity. It was about finding somewhere to simply exist after grief had upended his life. O'Hanlon, known to audiences for his comedic background, brought a natural lightness to the character without ever making him a punchline. Jack solved cases through patience and conversation rather than sharp deduction, letting people talk themselves into revealing more than they meant to. His version of the outsider learning to belong arc was less about culture shock and more about emotional recovery, a man slowly remembering how to be present in his own life. What makes Jack's exit particularly interesting is that he wasn't struggling on St. Marie at all by the time he left. He'd built friendships, found his footing, and become genuinely good at the job. That comfort, though, was exactly the risk. The island could easily have become a pleasant place for Jack to stay indefinitely instead of moving forward, a beautiful holding pattern rather than a step toward healing. His departure came from recognizing that grief isn't something scenery can permanently resolve. You can heal somewhere beautiful, but eventually you have to decide whether to keep living inside the healing or return to the world it prepared you for. Jack chose to return to his life. It's a quieter kind of ending than Poole's or even Humphrey's, but fits the character perfectly. He arrived grieving, and he left ready. If Poole was uncomfortable and Neville's predecessors carried emotional wounds, Ralph Little's Neville Parker took discomfort to an entirely different level. He was allergic to seemingly everything the tropics could offer, terrified of insects, weather, uncertainty, and virtually any form of social risk. On paper, that sounds exhausting to watch for more than a few episodes. In practice, it became the show's longest and most patiently built emotional arc, running across more series than any detective before him. Neville's fears weren't just comic relief, they were the architecture of who he was, a man whose anxieties had quietly shrunk his world down to something he could control. St. Marie systematically dismantled that control, throwing him into new friendships, unfamiliar food, romantic vulnerability, and situations he couldn't manage from a safe distance. The transformation wasn't rushed or overstated. He remained anxious. He remained a little awkward, but he stopped being ruled by those instincts the way he once had. By the time he departed the show, having fallen for Florence and finally found the nerve to choose a future with her, his exit felt less like a plot device and more like the natural conclusion of years of careful character work. Neville didn't leave because St. Marie beat him. He left because St. Marie had finally taught him how to make a choice for himself, arguably the bravest and most human exit of any detective in the show's history. By the time Don Gillet arrived as Mervyn Wilson, the show faced a challenge none of its previous castings had to deal with quite so directly: audience awareness of the pattern itself. Viewers weren't shocked by a new detective anymore. They expected one. So Mervyn needed a flavor of discomfort that hadn't already been used up by his predecessors. Where Poole was rigid, Humphrey chaotic, Jack quietly grieving, and Neville anxious, Mervyn arrived guarded, defensive, sharper-edged, and noticeably less charmed by the island than the men who came before him. He doesn't read as someone who stumbled into paradise by accident. He reads as someone carrying something deliberately hidden, dropped into a community that has a habit of exposing exactly what people try to keep buried. That's a smart evolution of the format because it reframes the central question the show always asks. Not will discomfort turn to affection, but what exactly is this man protecting, and what will it cost him to let it go? None of these individual arcs would land nearly as well if the show reset everything each time a new detective arrived. What actually keeps the series stable through 5 lead changes is the surrounding world that never leaves. Commissioner Selwyn Patterson has watched every single detective come and go, giving the show a kind of institutional memory that ties 5 very different eras together. The local police team, with its own rotating cast of departures and returns, supplies the rhythm and familiarity that keeps St. Marie feeling like a real, lived-in place rather than a revolving stage set. This is really the core trick behind the show's longevity. The detective is the visitor, but the island is the constant. When other detective dramas lose their lead, the whole world of the show tends to feel diminished because the setting was always secondary to the character solving the crimes. Death in Paradise inverted that relationship almost from the start. St. Marie was never just scenery for a detective story. It was always the actual main character, and the various detectives were passing through someone else's world rather than the other way around. It isn't only the detectives who come and go. Over the years, St. Marie has said goodbye to a long list of beloved supporting characters, officers, love interests, and friends who each got their own quiet send-off. Some left for promotions elsewhere. Some left to be closer to family. Some vanished from the show entirely, only to be mentioned again years later as part of the island's collective memory. These departures matter more than they might first appear because they reveal that St. Marie itself isn't frozen in time the way it might feel to a casual viewer. It only seems eternal because the turnover is managed so carefully. One farewell here, one new face there, spaced out just enough that the audience never feels the ground shift too much at once. If the entire supporting cast rotated at the same pace as the lead detective, the show would lose its sense of home. If nobody ever left at all, it would start to feel artificially preserved, like a museum exhibit rather than a living community. Instead, the show has learned to let go gradually, giving each departure enough room to land emotionally without destabilizing everything around it. That balancing act is arguably just as important to the show's survival as any individual detective's arc, because it's the supporting characters, not the revolving lead, who give returning viewers the sense that they're checking back in on old friends. Strip away the specifics, the ice pick, the heartbreak, the phobias, the grief, and a single structural rhythm emerges. A new detective arrives carrying some flaw or wound the island is uniquely built to expose. St. Marie forces him into contact with it through the community, the routines, and the endless string of murders he has to untangle. Slowly, almost without the character noticing, he changes. And the moment he changes enough to feel truly settled, the format runs out of tension to give him, because the show was never really built to showcase comfort. It was built to showcase transformation. That's the beautiful contradiction sitting underneath every season. Viewers want St. Marie to stay exactly the same, familiar and unchanging, a place they can return to every week like an old friend's living room. But the emotional engine of the show depends on the person standing in the middle of that familiar world constantly shifting, growing, and eventually moving on. If any detective stayed forever, the writers would eventually have to choose between letting him stagnate or turning him into someone who no longer fits the premise that made him interesting in the first place. Neither option serves the show. So instead, the door stays open, and it always will. By the time each detective boards that final plane out of St. Marie, he leaves something behind that outlasts him. Poole left the show its willingness to take real risks, proof that even the central character could be removed without ending the series. Humphrey left proof that healing doesn't require permanence, that a person can be rebuilt somewhere and still choose to leave once rebuilt. Jack left the idea that grief has a shelf life, that recovery means eventually stepping back into your own life, rather than hiding in someone else's paradise. Neville left the clearest evidence, yet that fear, however deeply rooted, can be unlearned given enough time, patience, and the right people around you. And Mervyn, whatever his story ultimately becomes, is already adding a new thread to that legacy, the idea that not every wow needs to be an obvious one for the island to eventually find it. Perhaps the clearest sign that this pattern is more than a coincidence is what's happened to the format outside of St. Marie itself. Humphrey's return in the spin-off Beyond Paradise showed that the emotional core of the show, an outsider settling into a close-knit, secret-filled community while solving crimes, didn't actually need a tropical island to work. It needed the relationship between a flawed investigator and the place trying to change him. Move that relationship to an English coastal town, and the formula still holds. A further spin-off, Return to Paradise, pushed the idea even wider, proving that the franchise had stopped being about one specific island and had become something closer to a repeatable blueprint. That's a remarkable outcome for a show that, on paper, should have collapsed the moment it lost its original star. Instead, every departure ended up teaching the franchise something it could reuse. A detective can leave without the audience abandoning the story. A character can be given an entirely new life in a different setting and still feel like the same person. A formula built around change, rather than despite it, turns out to be far more durable than one built around a single irreplaceable star. So, why does every detective on Death in Paradise eventually leave the island? Not because the writers are careless with their leads, and not simply because actors want to go home to their families, though that's certainly part of the practical reality of filming for months at a stretch in the Caribbean heat. The deeper reason is structural. This is a show built entirely on the tension between an outsider and a place that refuses to let him stay unchanged. Once that tension resolves, once the outsider finally, fully belongs, the story he was brought there to tell is finished. St. Marie was never meant to be a destination. It's a turning point, a place where the audience gets to watch someone arrive broken in some specific, particular way and slowly, believably become whole enough to walk away. The killings give the show its plot, the scenery gives it its charm, but the quiet, repeating question underneath every single season is really about the detective, not the crime. What kind of person do you become when you're pulled out of the life you understand and dropped somewhere that won't let you hide? Richard answered with defiance, and the island answered back by taking his life. Humphrey answered by choosing love over the paradise that had rebuilt him. Jack answered by finally letting grief loosen its grip. Neville answered with the bravest thing he'd ever done, walking toward uncertainty instead of away from it. And Mervyn Wilson is still writing his answer, one case, one guarded silence, and one slow crack in the armor at a time. That's the real magic trick behind Death in Paradise. It isn't a show about a detective who happens to live somewhere beautiful. It's a show about paradise itself, patiently waiting for the next person who needs it, and eventually letting him go once he doesn't need it anymore.